Good afternoon, everyone. We welcome you to this conversation about RJE pedagogy. It's a conversation that we've been wanting to have for a very long time. At EMU, the theory of RJE is embedded in our teacher education program. With much appreciation for Cathy Evans' work, my colleague, in the field of RJE, and her contributions to an RJE framework, program, and practices, we have incorporated this into our teacher education program. This webinar today builds on the everyday work that we do at EMU. It's grounded in theory and in practice and in values. And the cycle of reflection, theory, and action that you see presented on this first slide epitomizes the work that we do on a daily basis. This is who we are conceptually, and we're thrilled that you too are interested in this work, and we thank you for joining us today, for carving out time in your life for this conversation. I am Cathy Smeltzer Erb, Director of Undergraduate Teacher Education, and alongside my colleague, Cathy Evans, Associate Professor in Teacher Education, we look forward to this time with you.
Thank you, Cathy. We thought it was important to give a brief background definition of restorative justice in education for those of you who may be new to the field. This is not a new field. At its core, restorative justice predates all of us and is brought about because of the wisdom and the teachings of Indigenous people. And we want to just take a moment and honor those teachings and just acknowledge that none of this is original. It's not ours. We are borrowing wonderful ideas, and I'm so grateful for those who have predated us. Not just Indigenous folks. I'm so grateful for the teachings of Brenda Morrison and Dorothy Vandering, of Mark Thorsborn and Kay Pranis and Nancy Riestenberg. These are forerunners in the field of restorative justice in education, and I'm so grateful for their work, and it is on their work that we build these ideas. So Brenda Morrison defined restorative justice as a philosophy, a set of practices, a set of principles that attend to connectedness through affirming, repairing, and rebuilding relationships. These ideas of restorative justice as an ethos, as a set of values and principles, are important as we begin our work. When Dorothy Vandering and I wrote the little book of restorative justice in education, we wanted to include a definition that was broad and encompassing. So we defined restorative justice in education as so much more than just discipline practices or even how we build community, but facilitating learning communities that nurture the capacity of people to engage with one another and their environment in a manner that supports and respects the dignity and worth of all. Grounded in values, some of the values that have typically been associated with restorative justice in education are respect, dignity, mutual concern, a fundamental belief that all people are worthy and relational. Stutzman, Amstutz, and Mullet talk about truthfulness and dependability, self-control, acceptance, responsibility, accountability. And then Pranis goes into a little bit more detail and talks about both process values as well as individual values, the way we do processes as well as the way we interact. And finally, some principles of restorative justice in education, things like relationship and meeting core needs, and acceptance of conflict as something that is typical in relationships and should be embraced rather than avoided. Accountability, but accountability within supportive environments. And then experiences of justice and injustices. Other principles that have been shared throughout the years, growth mindset, shared ownership, both proactive and responsive implementation, acknowledgement that race and other identity markers are important when we think about restorative justice practices. So these principles that guide our work ground us. And they ground our discussion today in a restorative justice pedagogy. Like, we can't just put restorative justice out here and assume that it's about these things. When Ann Gregory and I wrote the policy brief last year, we included staff behaviors, not just student behaviors, policies and procedures, pedagogical choices, curricular decisions, school-wide decision-making process. And there would be so many other things. But when we talk about this, often people say, well, what do you mean by pedagogical choices or curricular decisions? And so Cathy and I have been having so many good conversations about what do we mean by pedagogical choices and curricular decisions. So we've been working on this for a while and kind of thinking about this, and I'm really excited to be with y'all today and begin a conversation to think about what this looks like.
So today we are linking the RJE components that you see in this diagram here: nurture healthy relationships, repair harm and transform conflict, and create just and equitable learning environments with Tomlinson's theory as a comprehensive approach to thinking about pedagogy. And we are using Tomlinson's theory, those 5 points, the 5 elements. And Cathy, if you want to advance, please.
Yeah.
Thank you. The middle part of this model that has the circle around it incorporates the content and the process, the product, affect, and learning environment. And when we look at content, we're going to incorporate or include curricular decisions. When we talk about process, that will be related to instructional practices. Product is about evaluation and feedback mechanisms. Affect focuses on relational centering, and the learning environment is the physicality of the classroom environment. And we acknowledge as we come into this work that educators may be doing many of these pedagogical practices already. And our focus today is on pedagogy of these 5 areas from an RJE lens and the intentionality of these practices in our work as educators. So I want to introduce the framework that guides an RJE pedagogy. We have developed guiding questions for each of these 3 RJE components, which you see in the column on the left, with the 5 elements of pedagogy from Tomlinson's theory along the top row. And so, for example, we ask the guiding question, if you look at nurture healthy relationships pertaining to content, we ask the guiding question, what does content look like when we nurture healthy relationships? Or with process, what do instructional processes look like when we nurture healthy relationships, and so on. And we are going to outline using these guiding questions, we're going to outline principles and talk about examples for each of these guiding questions as a framework of RJE pedagogy.
Cathy, before we move to the next slide, can I just insert that there have been some conversations about restorative justice pedagogy, and I would be remiss if I didn't note those specifically. We are particularly indebted to a book by Maisha Wynn, Hannah Graham, and Rita Alfred. And I just want to recommend this book, Restorative Justice for the English Language Arts Classroom. Their work has been super inspirational for us, as well as the work of Llewellyn and Parker, Christina Llewellyn and Christina Parker, Barb Taves, and then Lindsay Pointer have all been beginning some conversations about what restorative justice pedagogy, and I just want to make sure we give a nod to those folks who have been doing this work a little bit. So thank you.
Yes, thank you, Cathy, for that attribution. Much appreciated. So let's get started then as we take a look at the questions, the guiding questions that I noted. And we'll start with the area of content. Excuse me. So we asked the question, what does our content look like when we nurture healthy relationships? And we start to answer that question by honoring the learner's experience, by recognizing the prior knowledge that a learner brings to the classroom and the story of that individual when we make content-related decisions. That requires that we move beyond facts and we look at the relational aspects of content. So we highlight those human-focused impacts of curriculum and content. For example, in a novel or a historical account, we may have students create a relational web, a concept map of sorts that helps them break apart and integrate and begin to examine the relational aspects of the content that they are studying within that novel or that historical account.
So when we think about looking at repair and harm, what does our content look like if we are focused on repairing harm and transforming conflict? All content, almost all, is embedded with conflict. Like we see conflict in so many different places in our biology, in our history, in our literature. So shining a light on that conflict and helping students notice where the conflict was and how it was resolved or how it was transformed. Did it lead to harm? Did it lead to good outcomes? And helping students learn to think about conflict in healthy ways. Not shying away from hot button topics, not shying away from difficult topics. So intentionally including content that raises awareness of our need for healing, our need for repair. And for example, in current events, like, can we not avoid talking about the Tulsa Massacre, but rather look at the Tulsa Massacre and the history of that, but also using that as a way to talk about economics, a way to bring that into our language arts classrooms, and looking at the multi-generational implications of that event and how that might impact even our current events. So not being afraid of those, but using those as a way to bring in discussions about conflict and harm.
So if we ask the question about what does our content look like when we create just and equitable learning environments, we think about representation. How does our content center authors? Who are those authors? Who are the inventors, the individuals who have been invisibilized in our content areas? Perhaps women, BIPOC persons, LGBTQ plus persons. Wynn helps us think about this in terms of how we engage emancipatory literacies that develop a critical action-oriented consciousness. For example, we may audit classroom texts and resources that we make available to learners and ask the questions, who are the authors? Whose perspectives, whose identities are represented here? Are characters and perspectives represented reductively or holistically? Are there harmful depictions of individuals or groups of individuals that we need to examine more closely? And then if we look at process, we ask the question, what do instructional processes look like when we nurture healthy relationships? And this requires that we devote the time, that necessary time in our classroom settings, to building a healthy and supportive classroom community. And that will take us time because relationships take time to develop and to build in healthy ways. And we highlight the unique experiences of participants and of all participants in those learning environments. For example, we create spaces for students to grapple with material in ways that are relevant to their experience of learners. We look to them to bring their own experiences into the classroom, and that might involve interpreting literature from their own experience, through their own experiences. We provide examples in math that focus on problem solving and representing the people in our classrooms. We provide choice in the content. Can students grapple with that content in different ways? as opposed to presenting one option for students. And we focus on the ways of learning and being together that are common from what we know of our Indigenous peoples' experiences, and incorporate those practices into our classrooms.
So what do instructional processes look like when we focus on repairing harm and transforming conflict? Creating dialogic classrooms that value underrepresented viewpoints and not ignoring elements of power and privilege that often show up in our classes. Also, within relationships, like embracing the discomfort and the risk that's part of that grappling that Cathy was talking about, part of the disequilibrium process. Christina Llewellyn and Christina Parker, in their article that I have right here that I should show you. This is called Addressing the Who, or Asking the Who, a restorative purpose for education based on relational pedagogy and conflict dialogue. This idea of conflict dialogue suggests that we need for our students to be able to grapple with ideas and to wrestle with dominant narratives. When we create healthy relationships that can hold space for disagreements, and we allow that dialogue to happen that rests in the conflict, what happens is we end up empowering those voices that have been underrepresented in our classroom. And we allow them space to speak into a space, speak into the narrative of our history, our arts, our language, our readings, etc. And a lot of the times we can do this in circle. And so using circle processes is another way to just provide a place to process difficult information or new content that may be uncomfortable. Yeah.
What do instructional processes look like when we create just and equitable learning environments? And this calls us to challenge hierarchical structures. And Lindsay Pointer, and I'll highlight her book, The Little Book of Restorative Teaching Tools, she says that when a teacher's voice is heard and valued above all others, pre-existing hierarchies are reinforced and marginalized students are further silenced. And I think that's a really important way for us to think about creating just and equitable learning environments. We recognize and we bring light to the implicit and the explicit bias that shows up in unknowing ways, unfortunately, in our teacher talk, in the texts that we use, in the discourse that we engage in or that we allow to be part of our classroom environments. And we think of this as the teacher as facilitator in order to create these just and equitable environments. The teacher who, by nature of position in a classroom, has the authority to create collaborative learning environments. And this focuses on groups of students working together, but groups of students working together who are also given very clear roles and structures around how they function together as a group, so that we are looking at not further silencing those marginalized students. So creating equal opportunities for participation for students as both a listener and a speaker, both have valuable roles, and structuring those conversations to honor each student's voice, coming up with the protocols that help our students have those kinds of structured conversations. So many group problem-solving activities lend themselves well to this. I think as long as the teacher has an eye to exploring the implicit and explicit bias that might be hidden in those activities. So just ensuring that instructional approaches do engage the learner and engage all learners simultaneously.
Now we'll move to assessment practices, assessment and evaluation. What would that look like if we center healthy relationships? Means facilitating assessments that promote trust and growth rather than just evaluation and judgment. It means giving meaningful and personal feedback that reflects a teacher's understanding of the student's growth and learning. So, for example, providing authentic and real-life assignments invites multiple means of expressing what students know based on the student's choice, based on their strengths, based on what they bring to the classroom. One very concrete example of this would be the Where I'm From poems. This invites a student to write in a way that shares a piece of who they are. Wynn talks about this, or about bringing in their history, their gender, their ancestors, their ethnic and cultural roots, by giving space for them to talk about who they are, their identity markers. It not only helps them understand themselves better, but it helps us as teachers to understand our students more fully so that we can design assessments that actually reflect who they are. Another example is just encouraging that growth mindset language and watching our language carefully. So for example, saying, you have a really good start here. What if you add more here? Instead of just using multiple choice assessments, actually provide those assessments that allow us to understand how our students are thinking about content.
What do assessment and evaluation practices look like when we repair harm and transform conflict? And this involves extending the learning outcomes beyond the knowledge and the skills to include those relational dispositions for fostering healthy relationships within instances of conflict. When confronting cheating or plagiarism, perhaps, we give students opportunities to repair harm and to learn from that experience rather than to incorporate or implement top-down punitive measures. And the way we think about repairing harm in relation to how students perceive a fixed or a dynamic mindset is really important. Students, unfortunately, can come to us with a fixed mindset. So instead, let's hold a dynamic mindset about them, about their learner performance. Wynn talks about this in terms of focusing the feedback on the strategy or on the effect and thought processes rather than on our personal verification or dissent surrounding student input.
And finally, what do our assessment evaluation practices look like when we're working to create just and equitable learning environments? Y'all, the first thing I'm going to say is that standardized assessments are inconsistent with restorative justice. They just are. If you want to talk further about that, feel free to email us. But also beyond that, I think our assessments need to assume cultural responsiveness to the differences in students' strengths. We have to resist deficit views of certain students. We have to maintain high expectations for all students. And it goes back to that implicit bias that Cathy was talking about a minute ago. We have to check those at the door, taking that growth mindset in our assessments, incorporating loads of formative feedback and inviting students always to be improving and growing. Also, so just examples, asking questions and allowing the learner to sit with a concept rather than being told the answer if they don't get it immediately. Letting them wrestle with it a bit, reducing the need to immediately correct every misconception. That doesn't mean we leave those misconceptions in place, but it does mean that we don't jump in and try to fix because we don't think a student is capable of coming to that conclusion on their own. But rather scaffolding and giving them opportunities to come to those conclusions, to work through difficult concepts. We might use circle processes as a way to do that. We might use circles as a way to pre-assess prior knowledge and experiences so that it invites students to bring their whole self into a new content area.
So as we move here to look at Tomlinson's component of affect, we ask the question, what do relational interactions look like when we nurture healthy relationships. And first and foremost, we want to emphasize the importance of self-care. We need to, as educators, practice self-care so we can show up with the energy and the mindfulness to practice being restorative with ourselves, with our colleagues, and with our students. And in doing that, we also need to convey an ethic of care and compassion, resisting those hierarchical powers over and relying more on the shared power with students. And some examples of how we do that. We build relationships with students to know their interests, to know their life experiences. On a Monday, ask about their weekend. Ask them to give us some feedback. Ask about how what I'm doing as an educator is helping, or maybe, frankly, hindering their learning. What do I need to change to take care of the students in my classroom to build those healthy relationships? And let's learn to pronounce their names correctly and to use correct pronouns when we refer to students as well.
So what do those relational interactions look like when we're talking about harm and conflict? Well, I think one way is we model academic, social, and emotional support and repair when harms have occurred. And we demonstrate a willingness to model and admit when we're wrong. Also, I think it means not shying away from difficult conversations and conflicts. When something's happened in your class, don't be afraid to address it. It means that we need to be skilled educators and have the ability to address difficult situations. So rather than avoiding that challenging student, we actually move toward those challenging students, building those relationships in order to repair perhaps the harms that they've experienced with school and be a transformative influence in their lives. Also, it might mean, well, it doesn't might mean, Joe Brummer would like call me out on this, right, Joe? Would build resilience, like that we think trauma informed and that we build resilience practices through using growth mindset, through relationships, through being careful about how we use language and remembering to encourage students like, you can do this. This is hard, but you can do this.
One of my favorite songs comes from folk singer Carrie Newcomer, titled, "You Can Do This Hard Thing." Take a look. She's got a beautiful video starting out with her own struggle about a math test, a really helpful mantra for students in using growth mindset language. So what do relational interactions look like when we create just and equitable learning environments? It requires that we explicitly attend to dismantling the systems of oppression that impact the lives of our students. And the only way we're going to be able to do that is if we go back and look at what nurturing healthy relationships looks like and what we talked about earlier, getting to know our students, getting to know where they face challenges in their own lives and what's impacting them. Additionally, we develop classroom practices that correct those inequities in student status and in belonging. An example of this is that we convert the language of I or me to using we or us teacher language to represent the classroom as that inclusive learning environment where we want to bring all people to the table. We want all learners involved, so that we start using the language of tell us, show us, rather than, if I give the contrasting example of tell me about. In other words, we bring students and teacher, I might add, into that learning process by using language that includes all of us in that learning setting. And on a very practical note, we ensure that notices that go home to our students, families, and caregivers are provided in the languages of our students. Again, helping to create that just and equitable learning environment.
I just want to say we struggled with this box, not to put things in, but to narrow it down to just one or two examples. There would be so many things we could include here, and we just want to draw on the work of critical theory, transformative education, and so many other fields that are talking about justice and equity in our relational interactions, that may or may not be using restorative justice approaches, but are still focused on justice and equity. And just invite everyone to make sure you stay in touch with that literature as well. And lastly, we want to talk about classroom environments. What do our classroom environments look like when we focus on nurturing healthy relationships? And by classroom environments, I think we're talking specifically about the classroom design, the layout. And so, for example, how do we design our classroom in ways that demonstrate that we have an ethic of relational care and concern? How do we design our classroom in ways that promote social and emotional literacy, that nurture relationships between the students and the teachers and between students and students? How do we support a co-created learning environment? Also, learning is experiential in a restorative justice classroom. And so if we have our desks in rows, how experiential is that, right? So how do we set up our classroom structure so that it screams that we are experiential learning here, that we're not just learning about, but we are learning through doing field trips, play, art, activities, all kinds of engaged pedagogy. And setting up our classroom sends that message, whether this is a teacher-centered classroom or whether it indeed is a student-centered classroom. Even like the location of the teacher's desk and where the teacher is standing, all of those give cues about who matters in that classroom and how we are nurturing healthy relationships.
What does our classroom design or layout look like when we repair harm and transform conflict? And I think you might be hearing a theme here, and it's why these three pieces of the RJE model are in a Venn diagram, because they are not seen in isolation. But to repair harm and transform conflict, we need to incorporate trauma-informed and resilience fostering practices. And again, there's a whole body of literature on those practices and what that looks like. But that requires, too, that we know our students well, and we know how to respond in ways that care for them and help to take a role that we can take in repairing that harm that they have experienced. And we design, because again, we're talking about the physicality of the classroom. It also involves some practices that we put in place to make amends when harm has been caused. For example, we might draw from Judy Mollett talks about peace mats that are visible in the room as a place where students know where to take a conflict, how to work out that conflict, how to resolve it, and allowing space for that to happen within our learning environments. Or we might choose a making amends approach, which is a specific protocol that provides students with some prompts. It's teaching them how to recognize, firstly, when an amend is needed, but also how do they go through the process of making that amend. So giving them protocols that they can choose from that fit the situation to help provide them with the language that can help resolve that and talk through that conflict.
And lastly, what do our classroom design and layouts look like when we create just and equitable learning environments? As Cathy has talked about, we transform the role of the teacher from the teacher as the expert, the sage on the stage, to the teacher as a co-learner with not 2 or 4 students, the guide on the side. And this would be where I would just want to acknowledge the privilege that I have of working with Harrisonburg City Schools here in Virginia, as well as other members of the RJE cohorts, I am so grateful to be a learner alongside those students. They have taught me so much about what restorative justice looks like in practice. I'm grateful for their expertise and their leadership and their willingness to sit with one another and with me, and let's learn together what restorative justice and education looks like in practice. Another principle here to think about is how teachers audit language and how we think about the language that we use, and being so reflective about this, reflective about what's hanging on our walls, reflective about the books that are in our classrooms and that are sitting out, about the pictures and the posters. So for example, do we have posters in our room that represent all of our students? Are there images of people of color? Is there a rainbow flag or an HRC sticker? Above me, you see the all are welcome here poster. Are those kind of images sending messages to our students that they are valued and that they are welcomed? Also, like, is our classroom set up to make space for more morning meetings or circles that level the playing field and create more equitable sharing opportunities for hearing and valuing our students and our experiences? As we summarize, I think there are so many things that we could talk about. There's so many more examples, and we want to give opportunities for you as participants to think about the examples that you have in your life where content and product, process, and affect and environment can be influenced by our commitment to nurturing healthy relationships, repairing harm and transforming conflict, and creating just and equitable learning environments. In the Little Book of Restorative Justice in Education, Dorothy and I talk about social engagement rather than social control. And the belief that our starting point when we are together is going to be relationships rather than rules, people rather than policies, honoring rather than evaluating, meaning rather than knowledge, asking instead of telling, and well-being rather than success. This does not imply that, oh, shoot, there we go. This does not imply that our rules, our policies, our evaluation, our telling are irrelevant. It simply means that those things serve the needs of people living in the community and not the other way around. Thank you. We have left some time for some Q&A. I also want to note that the email addresses for Cathy Smeltzer Erb and myself are there. Please reach out to us if you have suggestions, critiques, comments, questions, all of the above. We've also left time for questions now, and I know that Paul is curating some questions. I'm going to give us a minute with the Q&A slide, and then we'll stop sharing. But I look forward to further conversation in response to your questions. So please feel free to add questions in the prompt in the Q&A section. And yeah, thank you. Kathy?
Yes, I see a question here that we'll respond to, and please continue to type in your questions and we will try to answer as many of these as we can. This question is, could you recommend a resource and/or examples for developing assessment that are more equitable and avoid a more standardized format, please? ? I am happy to talk further about that because assessment, specifically formative assessment, is one of my loves and my passions. So in answering that question, I would highly recommend thinking about formative assessments. And I can name a book that I use in my one of my methods courses at EMU by Rick Wormeli, Wormeli, and I say it's somewhat like a dictionary of formative assessment strategies, and it includes technology approaches too. But you can also simply just Google and look for formative assessments. The reason why I'm going to say that they are more equitable is because formative assessments, first of all, are not standardized assessments. They are the short assessments to complete throughout a class period, throughout a learning experience, to help the learner, most importantly, identify what they're learning. Yes, it does provide the educator with some of that same information, but a formative assessment, an assessment as a whole, I think, if it's going to be within an RJE context, should be aimed at helping the learner assess their own learning. And so I also think about formative assessments that allow all students to be on task simultaneously, because in an environment where we want to be inclusive, we also want to increase the time that students are, or let me say it this way, we want to increase the time that students are on task, but we also want to decrease the times when it's just a student and teacher in conversation, because that allows too many opportunities for the rest of the students to check out. So thinking about formative assessments that are short assessments that happen frequently throughout a learning experience, and that provide information for the student, for the learner, on how they are accessing and learning the content. And if you have a follow-up question, I welcome that on as well.
Mm-hmm. I see a question here about resources that speak more specifically to restorative justice pedagogy in each content area. You know, I mean, it is one of the things that led us to want to do this webinar. Is right now, the book by Maisha Wen and Hannah Graham and Rita Alfred is really the only book that I know of. I could be wrong. And if you know of them, please shoot them our way. But this book is specifically about the English language arts classroom. And I think that there would be room for more writing that are specific to specific content areas. But I think that there's a lot of work that we need to still do to discuss that. I see that Paul put in the chat about the RJE conference. Cathy and I will be doing a workshop at the Restorative Justice and Education Conference, bringing this framework, but it'll be a much more interactive session, and will allow for a lot more dialogue and discussion around specific content area. So come join us for the Restorative Justice and Education Conference, and we'll continue this conversation.
And Cathy, maybe I'll turn to the next question and then have you answer that one, although I have, I think there's a brief response I could provide. How do you suggest a teacher use these practices in their classroom when a school or grade level has set policy on discipline policies, such as giving warnings, removing a snack or recess, etc.? Thank you so much for this wonderful webinar. You're welcome.
Thank you.
One of the things I think about when Cathy and I were working on preparing for this, we tried to focus on examples, that pedagogy examples that we as educators can take on ourselves. Taking on the system is a bigger issue, and we obviously need to consider how we take on those systems too and change policies from within. So that would be one thing. If you can start to look at how you can incorporate with your own sphere of influence, how can you incorporate policies that are consistent with RJE? And then Cathy, I don't know if you want to answer or speak to other parts of that.
Yeah, I will bring attention to Fania Davis's book on race and restorative justice, where Fania outlines both the interpersonal work that needs to happen, but also the systemic and the structural work. And I think all of that is important for us as restorative justice and educators, right? And there are some things that we have immediate kind of jurisdiction control over, right? What happens in our classroom is more or less that. I also know that we live in systems that are not guided by restorative justice always. And so to what extent do we push boundaries and do we promote a more restorative ethos in our school? And how can we do that? So for example, I want to join the discipline committee for the school so that I could be proactively about changing those discipline policies. And not everybody will do that, and that's cool. And so like find out where you're at in that process and then jump in where you can. Dorothy and I in the little book talk about restorative justice as a compass. And Dorothy had talked about this years before we wrote the little book of restorative justice in education, but seeing restorative justice as a compass as well as a roadmap. But the compass is, we're going that direction. And I think we have to keep pushing in that direction, even if we're not there today. I will say that in her book, Justice on Both Sides, Maisha Wynn does talk about how it needs to be a roadmap too, that the compass alone isn't enough, that we need a roadmap with specific things to help us get there. And I'll just bring attention to the Restorative Justice and Education Facebook page, where lots of conversations are happening about how do we move schools towards different implementation levels and options, right? Can I stop sharing now?
Yes, I think you
got our
yes.
email addresses.
I think so. Yeah. Yeah. And just in addition to what Cathy shared, I think, to maintain a stance of hope in terms of it can be hard to bring about change and see change when it feels like it's at a snail's pace. But I think being optimistic, being active where you can, and finding people within your school communities that share the RJE philosophy and perspective, and finding ways in which you can create that ripple effect of change within your system. And certainly as a teacher in a classroom, if that's your experience, you have a lot of influence there, definitely. So remain hopeful and active.
Oh, I love this question. I'm going to read the question. It says, as schools return during and post-pandemic, which of these categories do you anticipate schools will struggle with most? Which do you think the pandemic has revealed as opportunity? Oh my goodness, like there's so much that the pandemic has shined a light on for us. I think coming back, I think it is absolutely crucial that we prioritize relationships at every turn. Everybody's worn out, everybody's tired. And I think we have to focus on building those relationships through a trauma-informed and resilience fostering kind of way. I think we acknowledge that we ourselves and our students are tired, and we meet that with strategies that will honor where people are showing up and how they're showing up. I also think that all of the pandemics that we've been struggling with lately, both COVID as well as police brutality, like all of these social things that have been going on, have revealed and shined a light on so many injustices. And I think we have to work really hard now that we've seen some of these things to not ignore them, but to actually not be afraid to talk about them, to invite our students to participate in naming and grappling with injustices that they've experienced, that they see, that we've all seen because of the pandemic, and invite them to problem solve with us about what to do about those things and how we might respond. Thank you for that question. Anything you want to add there, Cathy?
I think, no, I agree with what you've said. I think too that the nurturing healthy relationships is going to be a key factor, and I think has been already, where teachers have found pretty phenomenal ways in creating relationships amidst the turmoil of this past year. How would you start to scale what RJE pedagogical practices look like in a multi-tiered systems of support framework?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love thinking about those tier one things in the multi-tiered systems. Like, I want to do things for everybody. I also believe deeply in individualizing education. And I think both of those things need to happen. Meeting students' needs individually, but also bringing the collective together. I think some students are going to show up and they need more. They need more support in this, that, or the other area. And so when we move up to that tiered system, I think definitely there is space for tier two. But goodness, please, let's do so many of those tier one things so that we can keep students in the classroom, that we can keep them engaged in learning, that we can keep them engaged with their peers and such. Yeah, that's, I think, all I want to say. Do you want to add anything to that?
I think it's good. Yeah.
Yeah, one of my favorite examples of something a school did was making sure that students get off the bus and feel welcome, like that they immediately get that sense of belonging. And your friendliest teachers should be doing bus duty. So if you see yourself as a friendly teacher who really sees your students and who cares about them deeply, maybe that means you volunteer for bus duty so that you can be super intentional and proactive at greeting them as soon as they arrive at the school. It's those simple things that I think can make monumental differences in the lives of our students.
And we have two questions that dovetail nicely. And so I think maybe I'll read both of them. Can you talk more specifically about the intersection of RJE and diversity and inclusivity work? And the second question, and there's some prefacing here, but I think I'll go right to the question and maybe we'll speak to some of what's prefaced here in the chat. How do we hold ourselves and others accountable and heal? And then in addition to that, how can we help kids see the racial and ideological tensions, for example, January 6th, and talk about healing or restoring? Wow. I think back about some of the conversations Cathy and I had prior to today. And I think about, again, kind of that premise that we referred to throughout this webinar of not being afraid to have those hard conversations. And as we develop, and those are conversations that may not be conversations we bring up, but and sometimes they are in terms of the nature of the content, and that's a good thing. I mean, they need to be. But I also think about, and I think we can't underestimate the power of establishing those nurturing, healthy relationships with students. Because when students perceive us as trustworthy and safe places, they will bring up those conversations with us. And we talked earlier about, not shying away from those hard conversations. And those hard conversations may not be specifically geared at January 6th, but by having another hard conversation, it might lead to a hard conversation about January 6th. Because if students can know that we are a place of refuge and safety where they can question, they will ask those hard questions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I just want to also note that we don't get to have those kind of conversations if we don't build healthy relationships first, right? Yeah. In Kay Pranis's work and Maisha Wynn and in the book on English language classrooms, talk about this 4 quadrants, and like we spend half of our time building relationships and building trust so that we can do the deep work of talking about difficult topics and wrestling with content and promoting a growth mindset. And none of those things happen if we don't do that preemptive relational work, and how important that is in restorative justice classrooms. Paul says this is our last question. I'll read the question.
Okay.
Hi, y'all. I love this framework. As I consult with districts and schools, sometimes I notice restorative justice discipline getting set up as another form of soft policing. Can you grapple with that out loud? Maybe provide some examples of how this looks for people who are new to the field, possibly suggest ways for us to hold ourselves, adults, accountable in not using restorative justice practices as power over methods. Oh, thank you, Ellen. I saw your name in there. I hope it's okay that I named you, but that is such a lovely question, and it's so important. Like, one of those underlying principles and values of restorative justice is indeed accountability. And it can't just be accountability for our students, it's accountability for us. And one of the things that I believe deeply is that we can't invite people to be accountable to something that they don't already belong to. So if we haven't built the relationships, I can't ask a child to be accountable for how their actions have impacted the classroom. So we have to build those accountability systems in place where I'm accountable to my students. And I name that, and I wrestle with that as a teacher. And then we promote that we belong to one another. Respect, dignity, and mutual concern. We are together. And so the accountability that comes in those kind of relationships is way more difficult than some extrinsically imposed punitive system. In working through discipline situations where there's been harm, like the accountability that students have to their learning community, to their peers, to their teacher, is way more intense and difficult, in my opinion, than just sending them to the principal's office or sending them out of school. That actually inviting them to grapple with their own behaviors in relational ways that's the stuff. Then we're not only just dealing with this immediate behavior, we're inviting them to grow up into adulthood and to prepare them for doing that kind of accountability in their adult life as well. So I just think it's a longer term, it's a deeper understanding of accountability than just a top-down model that you bring up there. Just a reminder of the webinar, of the Restorative Justice and Education Conference. And I'm super grateful for each of you being here. Thank you. I look forward to more conversations.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, everyone.